Don't stop. I need this, she gasped. The rancher tightened his grip, and the door opened. Wild West, Harrison Grant stood on the porch of his ranch house, the cold wind biting at his skin as the vast open plains stretched before him. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting an orange glow across the sky. Another long day had passed, and with it, another list of chores to check off. The cattle were fed, the fences repaired, and now he could finally relax. As he turned to head back inside, he heard the sound of galloping hooves. At first he thought it was just another stray animal passing through. But then the hooves grew louder, and the sound seemed to come from the direction of his driveway. Harrison's hand instinctively went to the revolver holstered at his side. The ranch was isolated, and the only people who ever visited were either neighbors or, on rare occasions, lawmen. His mind raced, wondering who could be coming this late. The wind howled in the distance, mixing with the sound of the hooves. He made his way to the front of the house, squinting into the dimming light. A lone figure rode toward him, a woman on horseback. The woman was dressed in a long coat, her face partially hidden by the shadow of her hat. As she drew closer, Harrison could see her eyes, a mix of fear and determination. She pulled the reins of her horse to a stop just a few feet from him. "Evening, mister," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help." Harrison took a cautious step forward, assessing the situation. There was something urgent about her tone. He glanced at her horse, a well-groomed animal, but it seemed like it had been running for miles. "What's the trouble, miss?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "I'm being followed. They won't stop until they get me." Her words came out in a rush, and Harrison could hear the desperation in her voice. The woman dismounted from the horse, stumbling slightly as her feet hit the ground. Harrison took a step closer, instinctively reaching out to steady her. She looked up at him, eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Who's following you?" Harrison asked, his tone more serious now. He was no stranger to danger on these parts. Cattle rustlers, wild animals, and the occasional band of outlaws weren't uncommon. But this felt different. There was something about her that seemed familiar, like she didn't belong here. "The Green Ridge Gang," she whispered, lowering her voice. "They're after something I've got, something I can't let them have." The Green Ridge Gang was notorious, a ruthless group of outlaws who had terrorized the region for years. If they were after her, it meant she was in serious trouble. He didn't have much time to think. Harrison quickly scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The wind had picked up, and the ranch house stood alone in the middle of the plains. No neighbors were close enough to help, and the nearest town was miles away. "You can stay the night," Harrison said, making a decision. "But you need to tell me more. What is it they want from you?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "I can't explain right now, but if you help me, I'll make sure they don't come back, I promise." Harrison didn't trust her completely. There was something mysterious about her, but he could see the fear in her eyes, and something about her made him want to protect her. Maybe it was her vulnerability or the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I'll keep you safe," Harrison said, his voice firm. "Come inside and we'll figure this out." He led her into the house, closing the door behind them and locking it securely. The warmth inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Harrison noticed the woman was shaking, her hands trembling as she removed her gloves. "My name's Cassandra," she said, looking around the small cabin. "Thank you for helping me." "Harrison," he replied, offering a small smile. "It's no trouble. Just try to relax. You're safe here for now." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound coming from the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Cassandra's eyes kept darting toward the window, as if she expected someone to break through the door at any moment. Harrison could see the fear still gripping her. He knew this wasn't just about the Green Ridge Gang. There was something deeper at play here, but whatever it was, he'd help her get through it. "So what's your story?" Harrison asked, breaking the silence. "Why are they after you?" "I can't say right now," she whispered, "but I'll tell you soon. Just not yet." He could tell she wasn't ready to talk, and that was fine. He'd give her the time she needed. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back. Once she stepped inside, there was no going back to the life she had before. Whatever danger she was running from, it was now his problem too. He leaned back in his chair, watching as Cassandra wrapped her arms around herself, clearly exhausted from her journey. He had the feeling this wasn't just a random encounter. Something had brought her here, and somehow it felt like his fate was tied to hers. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Harrison's body went rigid. He glanced at Cassandra, whose eyes had widened in panic. Without a word, he stood and moved toward the door, his hand on the handle of his revolver. But before he could open it, he heard a voice from the other side. "Open up, Harrison," the voice called, rough and gruff. "We know she's in there. You can't hide her forever." Cassandra's face drained of color as she backed away from the door, fear flashing in her eyes. Harrison's grip tightened on the door handle, his jaw clenched. The Greenridge gang had found them. "Get ready," Harrison said quietly, turning toward her. "It's about to get messy." Harrison's heart raced as he stood by the door, his fingers hovering over the handle. The voice from the other side was familiar, but it wasn't a friend who was calling out. It was Vic Dalton, the leader of the Greenridge gang. Harrison had tangled with Dalton's men before, but this time things felt different. He could sense the danger in the air. Cassandra, still trembling, backed away from the door and moved toward the window. She peeked through the small crack in the curtains, her eyes wide with fear. Harrison could see the anxiety written all over her face. She knew what this meant. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I can't let them get me, Harrison." "You have to help me." Harrison turned back to face her, his hand still on the door handle. He wanted to reassure her, but the truth was, he didn't know what would happen next. He had to think fast. He looked out through the window, spotting Dalton's men gathering just outside the fence line. There were at least 3 of them, all armed and dangerous. The wind howled, and the cold air felt like it was biting at his bones. He needed a plan, fast. "Listen to me, Cassandra," Harrison said, his voice firm but calm. "You stay here. I'll handle this." Her eyes widened. "You can't just fight them, Harrison. They'll kill you." "I'm not going to let them kill you either," Harrison replied, glancing over his shoulder. He could hear the creak of the gang's horses as they moved closer. "We'll get you out of here." Cassandra shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They'll burn everything down to get what they want. Please, if we don't leave now, it's over." Harrison hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't want to leave his home, but he couldn't risk Cassandra's life either. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about survival. "All right," he said after a moment.
"We'll leave, but we have to do it quietly."
He moved quickly, grabbing his rifle and saddling his horse. Cassandra gathered what little belongings she had, mostly just the clothes on her back, and stuffed them into a small bag. She didn't have much, but that didn't matter right now. All that mattered was getting out before the gang reached the house. Harrison swung open the door just enough to slip outside, motioning for Cassandra to follow. The wind had picked up, making it harder to hear their footsteps, but it also helped mask the sound of their escape. They made their way around the back of the ranch house, moving quietly through the tall grass. The horses were stabled in the barn, and they had to be careful not to alert the gang. The barn was only a few hundred yards away, but every step felt like an eternity. As they reached the barn, Harrison turned to Cassandra. "We'll head west, toward the river. It's a good hiding spot, and we can take the creek bed to cover our tracks." Cassandra nodded, her face pale but determined. She climbed onto her horse with Harrison's help, and the 2 of them set off at a quick pace. Harrison kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. The last thing he wanted was for the gang to spot them now. For the first few miles, everything seemed quiet. The wind howled in the distance, and the only sounds were the rhythm of the horses' hooves against the ground. Harrison kept his thoughts focused on the task at hand, but in the back of his mind he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He glanced over at Cassandra, who was holding onto her reins tightly. Her face was set with determination, but Harrison could see the fear still in her eyes. She had a past that she wasn't ready to share, and whatever it was, it had brought her to this point. He didn't know the whole story, but he could see that she was running from more than just the gang. She was running from something much bigger. They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, the land stretching out before them in endless rolling hills. The sun was setting behind them, and the sky turned dark as the night crept in. The air was cold, and Harrison could feel the chill seeping through his coat. "Where are we headed?" Cassandra finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer now, but there was still a hint of fear in it. "There's a cabin by the river," Harrison replied. "It's isolated, but it'll give us some cover. We'll be safe there for a while, until we can figure out what to do next." Cassandra nodded but said nothing. She had no idea what would happen next, but she trusted Harrison. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone. As they neared the cabin, Harrison slowed his horse to a trot. He could see the small weathered building in the distance, surrounded by trees. The cabin had been in his family for years, a place where they used to go to escape the pressures of ranch life. But now, It would be their hiding place. When they arrived, Harrison led the horses to the back of the cabin and tied them to a post. They quickly dismounted and made their way inside, closing the door behind them as quietly as possible. The cabin was simple, with a stone fireplace and a single room furnished with just the basics. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Harrison lit a fire, the crackling flames providing warmth in the otherwise cold room. Cassandra sat down by the fire, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She seemed exhausted, her eyes closed as if she were trying to block out everything that had happened. Harrison couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for her. She had been through more than anyone should have to endure, and yet here she was, trusting him to help her. "I know you're scared," Harrison said, breaking the silence. "But we'll get through this. You're safe here, for now." Cassandra looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Harrison gave a small nod, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." As the fire crackled and the warmth filled the room, Harrison sat down across from Cassandra. The night was still, but the weight of the danger that loomed over them felt heavier than ever. He knew the Greenridge gang wouldn't stop until they found her, and they wouldn't show mercy. The two of them sat in silence, the crackling fire the only sound. But in the stillness of the cabin, something shifted. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were allies in a fight for survival, and somehow that was enough. The night had settled around them like a heavy blanket, silent and cold. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to chase away the feeling of tension that hung in the small cabin. Harrison leaned back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the flames. His mind was racing, but his thoughts kept circling back to Cassandra. She was still shaken, her face pale from the stress of the day. But there was something else behind her eyes, something she wasn't telling him. He could feel it, even though she hadn't spoken about it yet. Cassandra sat across from him, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. She hadn't said much since they arrived at the cabin. Every now and then she would glance over at him, as if measuring whether she could trust him enough to tell him the truth. But the words never came. "I know you're not telling me everything," Harrison said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. He didn't want to push her, but he had to know more. "The danger wasn't over yet. You've been through something that has you running from more than just Dalton's gang. What is it?" Sacastra's eyes filled with hesitation. She looked away, staring into the fire for a moment before speaking. "It's not just the Greenridge gang," she said softly. "There's someone else. Someone much worse."
Ooh.
Her voice faltered. I was supposed to marry a man named Garrett Wells. He's wealthy, powerful, but he's dangerous. I refused him, and he didn't take it well." Harrison sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he listened. This was the first time she had mentioned anything about her past, and it sounded like it was worse than he had imagined. "Garrett's not like the men Dalton leads," Cassandra continued, her voice trembling. "He's part of a larger group, a group of men who think they can control everything. And when I refused to marry him, it wasn't just my life I put at risk. It was the lives of everyone I love. Garrett's people are after me, and they won't stop until they find me. Not just for the money they think I have, but because I broke his pride." Harrison could see the fear in her eyes. It was the same kind of fear he'd seen in people who had been cornered by more than just outlaws. This was about power, control, and revenge. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Harrison asked, his voice gentler now. "You couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. No one should have to live in constant fear like this." "I didn't want you to get involved," she whispered. "I thought I could run away, disappear. But now," she paused, her voice breaking. "Now I don't think I can. It's too dangerous." Harrison stood up, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. He walked to the window and looked out into the night, scanning the darkened horizon. The wind still howled, and the trees outside swayed as if they were alive. Somewhere out there, Garrett's men were looking for her, and Dalton's gang wasn't far behind. The thought of her running, hiding forever, made Harrison's blood boil. He couldn't let that happen. "Listen," Harrison said, turning back toward her. "I'm not going to let them get you. We'll fight together." Cassandra looked up at him, her face a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You don't have to do this. You've already done enough." "No," Harrison replied firmly. "You've been through enough already, and I'm not just going to stand here while they come after you." Cassandra stood up slowly, her eyes locked on his. She took a step toward him, as if searching for something, perhaps a sign that he wasn't just saying this to make her feel better. We'll need a plan, she said, her voice more certain now. They'll come for us, and they'll be prepared. Garrett's men are good at what they do. But we have the advantage, at least for now. Harrison nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. He was no strategist, but he knew the land better than anyone. He knew the hills, the rivers, the best places to hide. If they could use that to their advantage, they might have a chance. We'll set up an ambush, Harrison said, his voice low and determined. There's a pass to the west, near the creek. If we move at dawn, we can use the trees to hide and wait for them to come. We'll have the upper hand. They won't know what hit them. Cassandra nodded slowly, her eyes filled with determination. It's risky, but it's the only chance we've got. If we don't stop them here, they'll keep coming. Harrison gathered the guns and ammunition they had, checking each carefully. Cassandra helped him pack, her hands moving quickly, her mind focused on what lay ahead. The fire burned low, but the tension between them remained thick in the air. By the time the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, they were ready. They saddled their horses in silence, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the still morning air. Harrison looked over at Cassandra, who was fastening her coat tightly around herself. You sure about this? He asked. Cassandra met his gaze, her eyes steely. I have no choice. They mounted their horses, and together they rode toward the west, toward the creek. The journey was tense and quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts, knowing that what they were about to do would change everything. When they reached the pass, Harrison dismounted first, motioning for Cassandra to stay close. He led the horses into the thick underbrush, tying them to a nearby tree. They found a spot just above the creek, hidden by the trees, where they could see anyone coming from a distance. Hours passed in silence. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves. Harrison's nerves were on edge, but he kept his focus. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. He glanced over at Cassandra, who was crouched low beside him, her eyes fixed on the path below. It's coming, she whispered. Harrison nodded, his hand resting on his rifle. It wouldn't be long now. And then they heard the sound of hooves in the distance. The sounds of hooves grew louder, reverberating through the trees. Harrison's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched lower, trying to blend in with the underbrush. His grip tightened around his rifle, every muscle in his body ready for what was about to happen. He glanced at Cassandra, whose face was set with determination, her eyes focused on the path below. She was ready. We'll wait for them to come closer, Harrison whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. When they're in range, we'll take them down one by one. Cassandra nodded, her jaw clenched. She didn't say anything, but the fire in her eyes told Harrison everything he needed to know. She was in this to the end, and that gave him a sense of peace he didn't know he needed. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, and Harrison could see them now. 3 men on horseback, riding slowly down the narrow path that led through the pass. The leader was none other than Vic Dalton, the dangerous and ruthless man who had chased Cassandra across the land. The other 2 men, rough and disheveled, followed closely behind. Harrison's pulse quickened. They were just a few hundred yards away now, but he kept himself still, his rifle aimed and steady. He could see Dalton's face, his eyes scanning the trees as if he could sense something was wrong. The gang leader was no fool. He knew they were being hunted. Stay low, Harrison murmured to Cassandra, motioning for her to stay out of sight. He could feel her presence beside him, her breath shallow as she waited for the signal. Everything they had planned for came down to this moment. The next few seconds would determine whether they lived or died. Dalton and his men came closer, the sound of their horses' hooves now clear in the still morning air. The path they rode on was narrow, bordered by trees and rocky terrain, making it difficult for them to notice anything out of the ordinary. Harrison's eyes never left the gang members, watching their every movement. Dalton's voice broke the silence. She's got to be around here somewhere, he said, his tone rough and impatient. Keep your eyes peeled. She's not getting away this time. Harrison's breath hitched. The moment was almost here. Just as the gang members were almost within range, a twig snapped beneath Harrison's boot. It was a small sound, but it was enough. Dalton's head whipped toward the noise, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. Stay calm, Harrison whispered to Cassandra, his voice barely audible. But it was too late. Dalton had already seen them. Ambush! Dalton shouted, his voice carrying through the trees. Take cover! In an instant, the gang members drew their guns and dove behind rocks and trees, returning fire. The crack of gunshots echoed through the pass, and Harrison immediately returned fire, his shots aimed carefully and deliberately. He couldn't waste a single bullet. The first man, a scruffy-looking outlaw, went down with a single shot to the chest. He fell from his horse and landed with a thud on the ground. The second man, startled but not stupid, took cover behind a boulder and returned fire. Dalton was moving quickly, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of Harrison. He was a skilled fighter, but Harrison knew this terrain better than anyone. He'd planned for every possible move, and now it was time to act. "Move!" Harrison barked to Cassandra. "Get to the horses. Now!" Cassandra didn't hesitate. She sprang to her feet and bolted toward the horses, her eyes never leaving the fight. Harrison's heart pounded as he watched her run, his rifle still aimed at Dalton's position. He fired once more, hitting the second man in the arm, but the outlaw didn't go down. He kept firing back, his shots wild and uncoordinated. Harrison's focus shifted as he saw Dalton make his move. The gang leader was charging toward the trees, his gun raised and ready to fire. But Harrison was quicker. He aimed and shot, his bullet grazing Dalton's shoulder. The leader howled in pain but didn't falter. "Damn it," Dalton cursed, ducking behind a tree to reload. He rushed forward, using the trees as cover, and closed the distance between them. Dalton's men were distracted by the exchange of gunfire, and now was his chance. When Harrison was just a few feet away, Dalton finally saw and aimed his revolver directly at Harrison's chest. The two men stood face to face, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. "End of the line, Grant," Dalton snarled, his voice dripping with hatred. "You're outnumbered, and you're as good as dead." He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding Dalton's shot, and fired back. The bullet struck Dalton's arm, knocking the revolver from his hand. The gang leader staggered backward, blood dripping from his wound. Dalton glared at Harrison, his face twisted in pain and fury. "You think this is over, don't you? It's never over." But Harrison wasn't listening. He had no time for Dalton's threats. The gang leader was finished, and it was time to end this for good. Harrison stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Dalton's chest. He was about to pull the trigger when he heard the sound of horses approaching from behind. A third rider. Harrison's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see Garrett Wells himself, the man who had caused all of this, riding in fast. Garrett's eyes locked onto Cassandra, who had mounted one of the horses, preparing to ride off. He raised his gun, aiming it at her. "No!" Harrison shouted, panic rising in his chest. But before Garrett could fire, a shot rang out. It was quick, precise, and deadly. Garrett's gun dropped from his hand and he fell from his horse, clutching his chest. Cassandra stood in the distance, a rifle in her hands, her eyes cold and determined. She had taken the shot. Harrison's eyes widened in shock as he looked at her. "You? I wasn't going to let them win," she said, her voice steady. "I couldn't let you die for me." Harrison's chest tightened as he looked at her, the weight of everything they had been through crashing down on him. She had saved him, and in that moment, everything had changed. Dalton, now alone and wounded, made a final attempt to flee, but Harrison was already on him. With one last shot, he ended the fight. The battle was over. As the dust settled and the silence took over, Harrison walked toward Cassandra, who was now standing next to the horses, her hands shaking but her expression resolute. "You saved my life," Harrison said, his voice filled with admiration. Cassandra didn't respond immediately. She only nodded, looking at him with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout the fight. "We both survived," she finally said, her voice soft. "And that's all that matters." Together, they stood in the quiet aftermath, the two of them, united by their fight for survival, ready to face whatever came next.